Welcome to the latest CEME podcast on the economy and business issues. Today I'm joined by Professor Philip Booth, Professor of Finance, Public Policy and Ethics at St Mary's University, Twickenham, and also Director of Catholic Mission here. And today we're going to talk about Catholic social teaching in the economy and business issues. So, Philip, thank you so much for participating.
Pleasure.
Many people will know you from your many years as well at the Institute of Economic Affairs as academic and research director there, with strong free market views on the economy. But how's your faith played out in terms of your economic views?
Well, the provision of goods and services, economic life in general, involves relationships, collaboration at every level between, within companies, between companies and their suppliers, obviously between companies and their workforce, companies and customers and so on. And therefore it's a very human activity. And as with any human activity, it's important that that takes place within a moral framework. And sometimes I draw an analogy with sex. It's often thought that Christians don't like talking about sex, but actually, in a sense, they put it on a pedestal. The Catholic Church, at least, draws an analogy between the marriage between a man and a wife and the relationship between Christ and his church. And of course, a marriage between a man and a wife must be consummated. But sex must be properly directed in an appropriate context, directed in a moral way, and in the same way business relationships, though not as important as sex, must also be properly directed in a moral way too.
Absolutely. And God has so many views and institutions in the social sphere, then why on earth wouldn't he have those in the economic sphere as well?
Yes, well, of course, Jesus was a carpenter. His stepfather Joseph was a carpenter. He was known as a carpenter. In one of the Gospels, I can't remember which one, he's actually introduced, "Isn't this the carpenter?" And so Jesus worked in a business sphere. He might or might not have employed people. He would have certainly had customers. And without business, if people merely try to subsist through their own efforts alone, they'll tend to live in dire poverty. But also, business requires relationships. We're not made to live on our own. We're made to live in relationship with others, and business requires the nurturing of those relationships
and voluntary relationships as well, as opposed to coercive relationships. And how does that play out in terms of your thinking from a Catholic perspective on the state versus the individual?
Well, that's actually quite a controversial subject within Catholic social teaching, and it's one on which the Church changes her view depending on what the Church would describe as the signs of the times, and also because these issues are not, if you like, revealed as divine revelation. They're not. The Catholic Church claims authority in the teaching on matters of morality and theology. Now, of course, there's an aspect of that relates to business, but when it comes to, if you like, economic and political institutions, the Church's view will evolve over time, and that certainly happened even in the last 140 years. So if you take the Catholic Church's first great social encyclical, published in 1891, which is really trying to express the Church's view about business, it's called Rerum Novarum and subtitled On the Duties of Capital and Labour. It's looking at the Church's view of business in the wake of the Industrial Revolution and the move away from basically an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. And yes, the Church does see certain roles for the state, but actually the strongest injunctions within that encyclical are to business owners themselves, to treat their workers in a moral way, to ensure that they have time off for religious services, holy days and so on, ensure that they are paid justly, and etc. And the Pope Leo XIII is pretty clear about what will happen to business people who don't treat workers well and behave ethically, etc. They'll have to answer to God for that in the next life, and that there could be suffer eternal damnation as a result of their moral acts within the business sphere. Then as time moves on, the Church begins to see a role for the government in economic life in different ways, sometimes to provide, if you like, an overarching framework for economic life. When the guilds and those other systems of sort of voluntary association and regulation break down, the church is kind of looking for an alternative. So we're talking here about the 1920s and 1930s. Then in the wake of the financial crisis, the church talked about how regulation might be necessary in order to, or is necessary actually, that the church said is necessary in order to deal with immoral and unethical behaviour and the effects of immoral behaviour within financial markets. Of course, the problem with that is that we can't bifurcate man and assume that there is a sort of perfect version of man within the sphere of government and in regulatory bodies, and an imperfect version operating within markets. So we can't expect to use the
fallen people in government.
Exactly, yes, yeah. We're all made out of the same clay. And we can't expect to use the imperfect institution of government to perfect the imperfect institution of the market, which is why ethics is so important.
I mean, you might say in some senses that actually Catholic teaching is not that far from Protestant teaching, in the sense that both have shifted with the times in many instances. I would argue maybe incorrectly, because God's word is eternal and God doesn't change his mind over time. It's our duty to find out what he wants us to do. But there is that sense in which things shift with the times. And I suppose what the classic example here in terms of the Catholic teaching would be, I know, the views of Pope John Paul II in the 1980s on the economy, well, let's say the current Pope, they will have a different view. And I'm being naughty now and you'll correct me, but I would suggest that maybe your views and Robert Sirico's views are probably a world apart on the economy, maybe from the current Pope. Is that fair, incorrect? Am I being a tinker?
Well, I can't speak for Father Robert Sirico, but in my case, yes, it would be incorrect, really. So the current Pope has described business as a noble vocation.
Yeah.
And that's very close to the way John Paul II talked about it. John Paul II didn't quite use the phrase the vocation of the entrepreneur, but he did talk in terms which we often use to talk about vocations when discussing the qualities needed by an entrepreneur. Now, Pope Francis, of course, went on to qualify that, to say it's a noble vocation when pursued in an ethical way for the promotion of the common good, etc., etc. And Pope Francis has certainly called out what you might call sharp business practice, greed, etc. But all popes have done that. He's also been very specific in relation to his concerns about inequality, but he has raised questions, in particular, corruption in economic and political life, which perhaps other popes have mentioned, but Pope Francis has dwelt on to a greater extent, which I would argue is the cause of the kind of inequality which we should take most seriously. And of course, coming from Argentina, he and being very knowledgeable, and his earlier experiences being largely in the South American context, and then of course in the Italian context, he'll also be acutely aware of how corruption very often involves corrupt relationships between big business interests, and he's talked about this explicitly, big business interests and government. So it's important to see the context, I think, of how Pope Francis is
in that context. You know, all Christians can agree on those issues, but there does seem to be, let's say, a divide between, let's say, with views with regard to the role of the state and the extent of the state, which is not Catholic specific, it's Christian generally.
No, sure, yeah, okay. Pope Francis has written two social encyclicals and a couple of other prominent documents which had significant coverage of social and economic issues. And he has raised the question of the regulation of economic life, and he's done so actually to an even greater degree in some of his shorter speeches, homilies, etc. And often talked, sometimes in an Italian context, about the need for greater regulation of labour markets, for example, and been quite specific about that. Now, you and I would probably look at the regulation of labour markets. We'd look at the Italian approach to that. We would see that Italy probably has the most regulated labour market, or one of the most regulated labour markets in Western Europe or the OECD, and the problems that brings in terms of youth unemployment, etc., are really quite serious. But Pope Francis's views here are not radically different from other popes. Other popes have raised these questions. Pope Paul VI wrote an encyclical, Populorum Progressio, which you could argue was, in many senses, quite protectionist. And Pope Francis has been critical of globalization, but not so much the principle of globalization, but how it's worked out in practice, and how some people have suffered from certain aspects of it. So no, I don't think Pope Francis is that different from his predecessors. In fact, including John Paul II.
Interesting. You mentioned earlier about the role of business as a vocation, as according almost a Catholic work ethic or a Catholic business ethic. Do you want to develop that point? Because it is so, in an age where capitalism is divided and the excesses are rightfully criticised, but also one doesn't want to throw the baby out in the bathwater with the bathwater. And what part can Catholics thinking play in this?
Okay, so managing a business and owning a business to an even greater extent is a stressful business. So managers and owners tend to be well remunerated for their efforts, and rightly so. And you have the opportunity as a manager or as an owner to do things which are, sell things which are intrinsically immoral and act in ways which are intrinsically immoral. They exploit workers, sell pornography, get involved in corrupt activities with politicians in many parts of the world, and so on. But John Paul II, and I'll reiterate that Pope Francis would very much agree with this, talked about how business activity, rightly pursued, involves a number of qualities and virtues which are intrinsically good. And I'll just quote here from Centesimus Annus, where John Paul II is writing about the entrepreneur. He says, his intelligence enables him to discover the earth's productive potential and the many different ways in which human needs can be satisfied. It is his disciplined work in close collaboration with others that makes possible the creation of ever more extensive working communities, which can be relied upon to transform man's natural and human environments. Important virtues are involved in this process, such as diligence, industriousness, prudence in undertaking reasonable risks, reliability and fidelity in interpersonal relationships, as well as courage in carrying out decisions which are difficult and painful but necessary, both for the overall working of a business and in meeting possible setbacks. And let me just go back to that word courage, because that's important in the initial setting up of a business. Setting up of a business is a leap into the unknown. And in a sense, you have to detach yourself from worldly goods. You may hope to profit from it in the long run, but you're taking risks, detaching yourself from the certainties of everyday life in order to become
it's a
an entrepreneur.
sacrifice.
It's a sacrifice, and actually it's a sacrifice not unlike, in terms of the virtues that are required, the sacrifices that are necessary in the process of mission and evangelization. Somebody goes out to a new community. They may not know what that community is like. They may be exposing themselves to dangers.
It's a temporary cost for a long-term gain.
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Billy, do you want to just elaborate a little bit more about the role of personal responsibility, internal regulation, and the external state coercive intervention there? From your perspective, what are the relative importance? When do you need one and when do you need the other?
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to say from a purely Christian perspective when the role of the state should start and stop. What we do know is that you are not going to be able to perfect economic life as a result of action by the state.
Yeah.
We know that at one end of the spectrum. We also know at the other end of the spectrum that none of us believe in anarchy, and that business people should be able to go around murdering their competitors and exploiting their workers in certain ways. Now, where you stop, where the government stops on that spectrum is a difficult matter. I think what I would say in relation to the financial crisis is that the financial sector had become really quite highly regulated before 2008 in many ways. And it's not obvious that any of those regulatory interventions made the crash less likely or its effects more benign. And interestingly, Cardinal Vincent Nichols, or now Cardinal Vincent Nichols, when he wrote the election address to Catholics before the 2010 general election, he made the point because he'd spent a long time talking to businesses about the importance of ethics in business. And he said this in that election address. In place of virtue, we have seen an expansion of regulation. A society that is held together just by compliance to rules is inherently fragile, open to further abuses, which will be met by a further expansion of regulation. This cannot be enough. The virtues are not about what one is allowed to do, but who one is formed to be. They strengthen us to become moral agents, the source of our own actions. So I would say to all Christian ministers that it's really important that in their homilies and their other teaching of their flock, that they stress the importance of virtue and ethics in economic life, because ultimately that's the way we can, if you like, civilize economic life.
Fascinating. Philip, thank you so much. That's a really, really great talk.
Pleasure.